What's up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and this is the Homebrewed Christianity podcast. And today on the podcast, we have a special episode because this is the follow-up episode from the last one where Barry Taylor and I were discussing The Birth of a Nation, recent film, both the film itself, the cultural event that is this film. And today, my friend, podcast regular, author of the upcoming Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Salvation, subtitled How to Avoid Eternal Conscious Torment, Adam Clark, Professor of Theology, African American Religion at Xavier University, he's on the podcast. And he is going to be talking with his friend, the Reverend Eboni Marshall Turman at Yale's Divinity School. And they have an amazing conversation about the film, about racism, the white privilege, slavery, violence, domestic violence, and the cultural event of the movie, the history behind the movie and the slave revolt, all that kind of stuff. It's an amazing, powerful conversation. I'm so glad that when Adam and I were talking about doing this, he's like, let's do two-parters. I wanted to get to talk to Eboni. It's going to be so good. You're going to say to yourself, they should clearly come back on the podcast more often and talk about it, right? That's what you're going to think. Anyway, head to homebrewedchristianity.com after this, and you can find links to their websites, books. You'll even find a link. That's right. You want to pre-order the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Salvation by Adam Clark, you can do that. You can also get the whole series. You'll get the two that just came out. You'll get mine on Jesus. You'll get the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to the End by Jeffrey Pugh. But you'll also get, in like 2 weeks, the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to God. And then in like 2 or 3 months, the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Church History, because that thing is like almost done getting copy edited right now. So if you want to get those, go do it. Find links to all sorts of stuff. Before we jump into the podcast, I just got to tell you one thing. Guess what? Adam Clark is the first person we're going to announce as a guest at the Homebrewed Christianity Theology Nerd Beer Camp. That's right, Theology Beer Camp this January in Los Angeles. We've already sold most of the tickets. We have some left. And the first person we're going to announce that's going to be there is Adam Clark. He's going to be a guest. He's going to be lecturing. By lecturing, we mean like Theology Beer Camp style lecturing. Which, since Theology Beer Camps never happened, you don't know exactly what it is. Nonetheless, if you want to come, if you want to get details, then go to the website. And if you're listening to this and want to save $100 on your ticket, then just type in the discount code, Yay Adam. That's right. You listen to this, you're like, okay, I want to go to beer camp now. Then use the code, Yay Adam. You'll get $100 off until the tickets sell out. All right? That's right. Last little nugget. Renee Goodwin, who is a regular Homebrewed Christianity deacon out in, well, she doesn't live in Tulsa, but she goes to Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa. She put together a study guide for the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus. And we're working on creating a whole video series that goes through my book, and we're going to put them out and do like an online class through the book. So if you're interested in that, make sure you get on the Homebrewed Christianity email list, or if you want to participate in the class, then join the Homebrewed Christianity community. And in a few months, I think less than like 2 months or so, it'll start, and you'll get like the actual study guide. We'll send it to you. We're editing and making it called pretty and stuff, so you can print it out and use it with a group at your church or your reading group, hub group, or whatever. And then you'll get videos for each week that connect each chapter of the book. And you could use those, because everybody in book groups don't always read the book, but you could send them the videos, or you could watch them together and still do the discussion and everything. It's a way of being inclusive. Now, personally, as your author of the book, I don't think everyone has to read it. It's just they should probably have multiple copies. Anyway, I'm very excited that Renee helped do that. I'm going to be working on some videos and then putting them out there. So if you're interested, join the Homebrewed email list. Go to homebrewedchristianity.com. Or if you want to know you want to participate, then join the Homebrewed Christianity community. And you can do that by going to homebrewedcommunity.com. And this will be a class open for all of our members, people that donate every month, part of our secret Facebook group and all that kind of stuff. All right, there you go. Here it is. It's an amazing conversation. And I look forward to seeing you all in the future. Maybe beer camp, maybe in San Antonio at the AAR, American Academy of Religion. But if you're around there in November, I'll be there. PYM, Progressive Youth Ministry, in March in North Carolina, the mountains of North Carolina. I'll be there. Even Moravian. I'm going to this big Moravian thing, but I think it's just Moravians in Wisconsin, and I'm real excited about it. So I'm going to have to pull out my Zinzendorf. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. All right, peace.
Okay, well, Eboni, you just saw Birth of a Nation, so it's fresh on your mind. I saw it about a week ago, maybe a week and a half ago. What were your initial thoughts or your immediate reactions?
Well, I had a number of different reactions to the film. I must say, given the recent controversy around Nate Parker, that was top of mind going into watch the film. Right. And it was, even though I tried to keep the work separate from Parker's past, it was a bit difficult. So I must kind of put that on the table immediately, especially since it seems to me that the film dealt in pretty explicit ways with sexual violence against Black women. And so it was top of mind and continued to come up for me throughout the film. I had some really, I was yelling in the theater at certain points in time because I was really intrigued by how, I guess, the relationship between white women and Black women was portrayed in the film, as well as what I've read as kind of the pulling off of course, Dolores Williams, the triangulation of Black women suffering in the film between white men, of course, white women, and Black men. I was taken by what I read as a certain kind of silencing and invisibilization of Black women in the move toward, right, in the approximation of Black liberation, which of course is a recurring theme as we think about Black freedom and what it means to be liberated from kind of the multiple multiple and intersecting sites of oppression that the Black community in the U.S. faces. And so those are just some immediate thoughts. But I guess I was also very excited to hear or to see the story of Nat Turner on film, right? So this person that we know, Adam, has been so central, so significant to Black liberation or Black theological imagination kind of broad scale. And so I was excited to see the film, but a bit, or the story of Nat Turner portrayed, but a bit taken aback by how, again, as a womanist theologian, how Black women were marginalized in the story. And, as I think you will speak a little bit to the historicity and facticity of the narrative itself, but that was also a bit troubling. So a number of things stuck out to me.
No, I hear you. Coming into the movie, I read some things about Nat Turner in college. Right. So I had a general impression of Nat Turner as kind of an apocalyptic visionary of someone who, through his vision, kind of biblical vision of justice, actually initiated a slave revolt. And that's kind of my general impression, kind of that the Bible was like a conjuring tool to conjure up visions of Black liberation. And that was probably my first kind of dominant impression of Nat Turner. Mm-hmm. And then when I actually started to read Black theology, I saw Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, the three generals in the Lord's army in terms of Gayrod Wilmore.
Right.
I saw them as foundational to what Black theology is. I mean, God working on behalf of the oppressed Nat Turner was one of the main figures in looking at how God actually moved in the life of the oppressed. So I was really excited to see the movie. Mm-hmm. I had some reservations about Nate Parker and some of the incidents around that. We talked a bit earlier about that. There's been so much on that.
Right.
But I wanted to see, because of the kind of conversation that I thought that the movie would prompt, is how the movie would be depicted. And, in general, I think it's a film that's worth seeing, but I did have some type of, critiques and reservations of it, because part of it for me was how much it did not follow kind of the historical narrative of Nat Turner. Mm-hmm. And the way I kind of understand Parker doing, I see him more as like an evangelist or a gospeler, actually trying to gospel the faith of Black liberation through the biblical narrative, but not trying to follow, not as a historian, trying to actually, the story says it's based on Nat Turner. It doesn't say it's a Nat Turner story. Mm-hmm. So I saw Nat Turner as a prompt for talking about Black liberation, not trying to do like kind of historical documentary on Nat Turner.
Right.
There's a lot of disjunctiveness between the historical Nat Turner and kind of the proclaimed Nat Turner in his film. And that's where I kind of saw a lot of tensions in between that.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that being said, I mean, how much do we expect the movie to follow a certain kind of, movies about any historical figure, not documentaries, right? But films, movies, works of art. How much do we expect these to follow kind of a historical path? I think that's a really interesting question in relationship to the scandal, really. And I know that folks don't really want to talk much about that, but I do think that it's significant here, because part of the pushback has been, right, about, well, we have to get this story out here. This story is it's allowing young people and others who would not necessarily know anything about Nat Turner to come to know who this person is. And when we think about that kind of narrative resisting other spaces that are calling for boycotts of the film and other things like that, right? And we recognize that the film is not actually historically accurate in many ways. I just wonder how that plays together.
Well, for those who may be listening to us that are not familiar, let's kind of be specific about first the controversy and then the historical narrative that we keep referring to.
Sure.
First, we'll talk about the controversy.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe you could recount it better than I can. I mean, well, let me start from what I remember. When Nate Parker was 19 years old, he was charged with, he was accused of raping a young lady in college. They were both intoxicated, and he invited his friend and himself to have sex with a woman who was, I guess she was either semi-conscious or unconscious and
unable to offer consent.
Right.
That's for sure.
Unable to masturbate. It went to trial. His friend was convicted, and he was not convicted in terms of that. And so the reason why this becomes controversial is because right before the movie was released, there were a lot of people became aware of it, and the court documents, which many of us read, really showed, something very disturbing about it that wasn't probably brought. I don't know if it was brought into the trial or that people didn't weigh it as heavy as we probably would now. Right. Because it happened in 1999, I believe, or late 90s. And, 2016, we look at things a bit differently. Maybe that, So, many of us believe that, they were just wrong, that this wasn't a consensual situation, and that she didn't have the capacity to consent in that. And it's caused a lot of trouble between looking at the personal ethics of a director and the artistic production. Right. And how well do you link that to each other? Does someone who's done something terrible in the past, does it disqualify their art, or should it have a bearing on their art? Is it worthy of support, or should we actually not support it because we want to not support someone we felt has done terrible things?
Well, I think to suggest that we don't support something because someone has done terrible things is actually a bit, I think that's just, it gets us nowhere, right? Because in a sense, we all have histories. And, if you think just about the so-called founding fathers of our nation, right? These are persons who are celebrated in multiple ways, every day out of the year, right? Without questioning that the fact that most of them were also sexual predators. Right. So I think that conversation gets us nowhere. But in terms of the personal ethics of the artist and the art itself, as an artist, or at least a former artist, I guess once an artist, always an artist. But, so as an artist myself, it seems to me that art really is born from a place deep within, right? Even if that place deep within is, a former self from decades ago. Art is kind of an internality that is made external. Even when we are reading someone else's script or dancing someone else's movement, choreography, right? That it is something that is internal to the artist that is emerging in the work, which is what makes art so beautiful, so distinct, so just so full of life and force and energy. Right. And so I think the move to immediately disconnect one's personal realities from one's artistic realities is a faulty one. And, so I think there is some interconnectivity there. And I think we can talk about that in terms of how sexual violence is portrayed in the film and yet not attested to in historical evidence. We can talk about that later. But in terms of Nat Turner's story, I should say, we absolutely know that the rape of Black women within American slaveocracy was regular happening. So I don't know where that leaves us, right? So on the one hand, I don't want to dismiss work wholesale because of someone's personal liabilities, right? If we did that, we certainly would be in a very different place today, given the historical record, especially in this nation. But at the same time, we cannot so easily dismiss or separate the personal from the performative, because I think just in terms of artistry, they are deeply interconnected.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. But the only reason why I'm giving voice, because that's where you see some people call to boycott or refuse to see the movie, is because they're making those deliberations. And it's a difficult one to be consistent on, because there are so many artists that we might not recognize. It's hard when you disqualify an artist. If you look at people's personal ethics to disqualify art, there'd be very few art pieces or even kind of cultural products that we'd be able to embrace. Right. Because most of our favorite artists and cultural producers have done stuff in the past that are terrible, that we find objectionable. Right. So it's a tricky road. It's very tricky.
Right. And not just our artists, but, our politicians, pastors. I mean, we could call the roll on that one. I think you're absolutely right. Something that just came to me, Adam, as you were talking was, some of the impetus behind the boycott. So yes, right. There's this idea of, we are collapsing the personal and the performative, the art and the artist. But, the narrative based on the transcripts that were circulated in relationship to the sexual violence in the film those things taken together could also be very triggering for those, especially women who have experienced sexual violence. And we know that 1 in 4, and I don't have any empirical evidence in front of me, but I would venture that those numbers are actually a little bit higher than that. That 1 in 4 women have been victimized by sexual assault. After this past week on the political scene, we've seen women, we've seen articles in the New York Times even talking about the psychological trauma that even discussions of sexual violence can engender. And so I think there might be multiple reasons, not just, that people have called for a boycott. But I do think the bigger conversation and one that we are having in this moment is, how do we negotiate this both and, if we, or if we even should. So
I agree with you. I agree with you on that. And in terms of I guess the actual, theater, from a cinematic perspective,
right?
In terms of that, what were some of the high moments that you think in the movie for you? What do you think, and how are you reading his interpretation of Nat Turner?
Yeah. Wow, there were so many low moments, including like the theology. Like at one point, he was reading he was preaching from the Hamitic curse, right? The curse of Ham. He was reading about, and he looked on his father, and I thought, why did they choose that passage? I understand, of course, the relationship of that passage to kind of the birth of to the formation, really, of Black Christianity or slave religion, but. I just thought it was odd that this was supposed to be, or Nat Turner's story is supposed to be one of liberation, and yet that scripture that has historically been used to condemn Blackness condemn Black bodies would have. I didn't understand that. But a high point, I guess, I was really. I'm torn and even kind of articulating this, but there was a moment when I found myself smiling while watching the film when Nat was beginning to fall in love with his wife. Mm-hmm. And for me, that was significant because it revealed a deep humanity, right? This kind of, this love, this fledgling or burgeoning love, revealed a deep humanity within the most inhumane of circumstances. When Nat handed his wife to be those flowers as she was being taken to another plantation to serve, Cherry Ann, I think was her name, and to serve, her real name was Madison, but Cherry Ann was, I guess the slave name, her mother named her Madison though, was going to serve Sam, the master's sister, on another plantation after she had gotten married. He handed her flowers. And I just thought, for me, that was such a beautiful moment, such a deeply human moment, that even within the most dehumanizing of circumstances, there is this ability to love, and to love in ways that are deeply, I think, redemptive. And so that was a powerful moment for me, and just kind of being myself, a hopeless romantic in a net of fugitivity. That was just beautiful. Another moment that was really powerful for me, and I found myself kind of speaking back to the screen, was toward the end when they were gathered, the men, because there were no women. And again, I got to lift that up. There were no women present, but the men were gathered in the woods, in the forest, and they were, I guess, considering moving forward into Jerusalem. And it was this moment they began to recount what they would have been doing at 5:30 or 5:35 a.m. any other morning. And this is certainly a paraphrase, but maybe they did actually say it. They said something like, not today, not today. And that moment, and you saw in that moment that even if it was just that moment, though they might be lynched or shot down, and they were, within hours, the taste of freedom, right? I felt the taste of freedom. Yeah. And, and then they decided to go forward into Jerusalem, knowing really what was waiting for them. They knew that the white men there had guns, but that taste of freedom just gave them all the strength in the world. Right. And that was a really beautiful moment for me in the film. Right. I found myself saying, yeah, let's go to Jerusalem.
Yeah, that is such an ironic name. And that is historically real. They renamed
Jerusalem,
it.
Right?
Yeah. They've renamed it since then, but it was Jerusalem, Virginia.
Right. But they never made it, right? I mean, they never got there.
Historically, they never made it to Jerusalem. They got captured. But one of the things I really thought that I liked about the movie also was the beginning when they showed the African rituals and religion, where they were talking about that he was conceived with a special sense of purpose. And I think like the scholarship over the last kind of 30 years have really re-emphasized the African factor within Christian faith, especially in that historical time period, where you had the actual, I think his mother was born in Ghana. I think she was Akan. I think that's what they speculate. She was Akan.
I think it was his grandmother.
Yeah, I think.
Right? It was his grandmother. Right?
Yeah, I think both though, because
both of them? Okay.
I think both of them were, and his father had run away when he was younger, historically.
Right. Okay.
I believe so. I think that's accurate. But the point being is that to really try to talk about he's a child of God, he had a special purpose. They looked at the 3 marks. One was courage, one was wisdom, one was vision. I thought that was a deep sense of reaffirming kind of Black religion and historically. So I thought that was really responsible to do that and to show how Black Christianity is a multi-faith tradition in terms of that. And also the idea about reading, we tend to, one of the things that when I talk to my class about the movie, it's hard to me, it's like, what's the difference between someone who can't read and someone who doesn't read, right? Like the fact that it was criminal for Black people to read. I don't think we take that seriously enough, right? Like it's a revolutionary act to actually be able to read and write. And we don't look at that as tools of liberation. So many of us just take it for granted or we don't practice. It's like when I think about students today who go to college and they come to class unprepared, they don't read their books and that kind of thing. And I'm not talking about just Blacks, I'm talking about all college students. It's like there was a time in history when reading was seen as almost like a magical capacity to be able to form and to think outside your circumstances. And for him to be able to read and be celebrated, it was like a gift from God. But at the same time, what was interesting, the response to his reading was that when he came into the
library
they said like, look, those books
are for white
not
folk.
For you. Those are for white folk. And they gave him the Bible as a tool of subservience. And it reminded me of Elijah Muhammad's critique of Christianity, that Christianity is a white man's religion, or a slave-making religion. So part of what was interesting in the film that I don't think has gotten enough comment is the role of Christianity, which is at the heart of Black theology. Is Christianity a revolutionary, a liberative religion, or is it a religion that domesticates and makes one docile and passive? And those two tensions are played out throughout the movie about this kind of slave-making, domesticating religion, and this kind of liberative, revolutionary revolt religion. And to me, that's where he becomes the heart of liberation theology, is those two tensions about how Christianity actually is formed are two things that kind of make their way throughout the film.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I mean, and that gets replayed throughout history, right? When we hear, we find Benjamin Mays talking about compensatory religion and prophetic religion, right? And we find that just repeated even today, right? You have kind of social gospel oriented Black churches, and you have priestly Black churches that have, no comment or no conversation around matters of justice, especially as it relates to Black communities. So, I think that's a very important theme in the film that is replayed over and over, has been replayed throughout history. And also, I'm not sure we've actually been able to answer that.
Right. Those are still live tensions, and I think that's where the dialogue of liberation theology needs to continue. Right, liberation theology of all different dimensions really tries to make that distinction between everything that calls itself Christian is not actually Christian. Right, like Christianity has a certain type of content and substance, and at least for Black theologians, and James Cone specifically, he raised the question, can you be Christian and racist at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. That racism is a disqualifier of Christian identity. Right? That white supremacy is a disqualifier. So all of those type of, he would call what the slave master had is not Christianity, but white religion, right? Like the idea that, I think early on they talked about when Nat was supposed to travel to other plantations to preach, the idea was, that it was going to make them obedient, good slaves, that the act to be obedient to one's master was a requirement to get to heaven, right? That kind of a service. And the idea that, slaves be obedient to your master and to be deferential was something that was an act of faith and some type of promise of heavenly reward. And so it was an ideological tool. Right? And that's the way. I remember it reminds me of Frederick Douglass, who says how knowledge makes one unfit to be a slave, right? Knowledge, so that the more knowledge you acquire, the more you can kind of break the chains of personal slavery. And I saw Turner actually, because he could read beyond just the Bible and the text. And even he talked about reading, like he read signs in the sky, not just the biblical text. Right. He was able to kind of synthesize all this learning to talk about a liberative project of trying to free oneself in terms of rebellion. And I think that's why also what I don't think the film did well, which I read the historical account, is that he was a deep visionary since he was a child. And they talked about the visions, but I think the visions were much more prominent in the historical Turner and much more a prompt for the rebellion than what you saw in Parker's account of Nat Turner. Right.
Well, and to your point, there was a piece of the movie, a segment of the movie where he talked about, I think, where his wife had just been raped and she had been badly beaten, and she said, you taught me that God is a God of love. Yeah. Or maybe it wasn't that scene, but there was a scene where someone said, you said God is a God of love. And Nat says, yes, but God is a God of wrath too.
Right.
And this theme of righteousness and judgment that comes up in Cone's work repeatedly. And that I think contemporarily, in the contemporary church, we want to forget about the righteousness of God and the wrath of God. And we want to kind of, uplift or lift up this idea of God's love, God's all-encompassing love. I just wonder how we balance the two of those realities, right? A loving God and a wrathful God, or a God of righteousness, right? In the way, part of why liberation theology is so marginalized in churches and in theological institutions is because it's asking these hard questions of us, right? It's asking us, what is the substance of our faith? It's asking us, can we be Christian, right? And be racist and be sexist and or classist and or heterosexist, right? So it's asking these hard questions of us, and not just saying, well, God loves everybody. What if God actually chooses sides? Which is, I think what we're seeing in the movie, we're seeing Nat make a claim that God has chosen the side. I guess to just echo Cone here in a very direct way, of the oppressed, right? That God is on the side of those who are enslaved and marginalized in society. And so that's difficult, right? For people who have never, been in that position. That's something, and yet call themselves or identify as Christians, as believers. What does it mean that God may not be on my side?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And one of the ways he's able to kind of make that claim is by showing the institutionalized violence of slavery, right? He has all these type of devices to try to show how brutal, cruel, and violent the slave system was. Mm-hmm. So that even the kind of arbitrary distinctions that people make between a good slave master and the bad or cruel slave masters get dissolved. And I thought that was a helpful device to say that, look, it's not a good and a bad slave master. It's that the whole system itself is demonic. It's evil, right? In terms of that. And they get to come at. And I thought, and one of the things, that I wanted to dialogue with you about in terms of that is that when he's trying to talk about the institutionalized violence of slavery, there's a lot about bodily integrity in terms of, and its violation. And I know that's like a strong theme in your work in terms of that. So I wanted to get your kind of perspective or insights into how Parker actually visually displayed how bodily integrity is being violated and compromised throughout the slave system.
Yeah, well, I think we certainly, there are so many examples from the movie. I mean, one that is very prominent in my mind is a brief scene of the little girl, the black slave girl, being let out of the house with a rope around her neck by as a leash / noose by a white girl, right?
Wow.
She pulled, do you remember that scene?
Yeah.
Pulled out of the house. And then he envisions that scene toward the end again when he's preparing for rebellion. So we see, I'm writing about girlhood right now. So in that we see kind of the very beginnings of a certain kind of bodily demonization, a certain kind of genealogy of Black bodily denigration, right? It begins even in childhood. Even the child is the child's body is unworthy. The Black child's body is unworthy, which brings up some interesting thoughts about anti-Black state-sanctioned violence that disproportionately targets youth. But that's Black youth. That's, I guess, another conversation. So that really is prominent for me. In other ways, I mean, of course, the lynching that, the film actually ends with him closing his eyes, in the lynch mob moment. I mean, he is strung up and, we watch him kind of take his final breath. Right. We see, and then the film immediately cuts to, or at some point the movie cuts to a young boy who is lynched, who is hanging from a tree, a woman who is hanging from a tree, multiple men who are hanging from trees, right? We see, so we recognize then that there was no distinction between the denigration of Black women, Black men, and Black children, right? That these were all, as opposed to, for instance, kind of Victorian codes of womanhood, the cult of domesticity, the cult of womanhood, that suggests that women have a particular place that is very different from a man's place, and that children have a particular place. That was not the moral code for the enslaved, certainly, right? Everybody was equally subject to a certain kind of dehumanization and a certain kind of death that is reserved for Black bodies. Right. And we certainly saw this sort of denigration in the rape of Black women. Right. That was very prominent in the movie, although
and the selling, the auction block. Remember, he got his wife. He convinced his owner to
buy his wife, right?
To purchase her, and it was like
And she's standing there and the auctioneer actually says she's not yet 18 years old, right? And she's, you could have a good party with this wench. he says that on the block.
Yeah.
The examples of bodily denigration are... Or
Black women being used as objects of pleasure, right? Like with Gabrielle Union's character, just kind of giving away you can have some whiskey and you could have the woman. Right. It's like same two type of commodities.
The wench. That is what they referred to Black women as in the movie, the wench. Right.
Also it's interesting between like those kind of just physical violence where the kind of microaggressions of the kind of, bodily, like, don't sass me. He had to look down and be so overly deferential. And if you're not, it's on pain of death, right? The kind of rituals of dehumanization and humiliation that were so arbitrary that if they're broken, one's life was physically at stake.
At stake, absolutely. That goes to the scene where Nat picks up the doll in the street and hands the doll, a child had dropped a doll or something in the street, and he picks it up and tries to hand it back to the child. And the white man, who was the father and the husband, begins to hit him with a cane and suggests he's going to call the sheriff, right? And then his master, Sam, I guess his name was Sam, I can't remember, he comes in and tries, does whatever he does. Life was, Black life could at any moment, be, Black death.
Right. And that's just the existential absurdity, right? Living with just under absurd condition and such arbitrariness that at any point in time, and there's no type of security or regulation. I mean, the most slight, break from protocol could end up with you or your family member being taken away from you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's the cruelty. Another thing I was thinking about is and I haven't heard this talked about a lot, but to me, I thought God was a character in the movie.
Okay.
Right? Like, because it seemed that there was such a reference both by the slave-owning whites and by Turner and all the enslaved Africans to God, as if God was some type of palpable presence who's actually interacting. And it seemed like that was a character, because when I thought about the historicity of the historical Turner, there are so many things that actually happened in Turner's life. And just for the people who may be less familiar with this, first of all, there's no actually historical record of the rapes being a prompt to the rebellion. Now, we're sure that rape happened. It happened often within the context of slavery, but there's nothing in the historical record that it prompted the actual slave rebellion. There's nothing in the historical record that Nat Turner actually killed his own slave master. He only admitted to killing one person within the entire 48 hours. What else was kind of different about he actually escapes at 21. The rebellion we're talking about is at 31, but 10 years earlier, he actually escapes and then has a vision that he needed to come back. He has a vision he thinks comes from Christ, and it's to go back to free his people.
Right.
So if this was like a personal thing, he could have escaped a long time ago, just like his father did. But he went back and then has the way the slave rebellion was depicted in the movie was different from the historical account. I mean, the historical account is very interesting. And I encourage all people who haven't read this to go back and like look at some documents. But one of the signs is an eclipse from the sun. Mm-hmm. And he reads the eclipse as being like a Black man's hand actually eclipsing the sun. And for him, that is part of the reason why he thinks Black people shouldn't be enslaved. It's because they should be free. And he thought that was the power of God actually working in that moment. And that was one of the signs that he knew that his people should be free. He conjures also a vision of Christ. Mm-hmm. and there's a certain richness that if you read the history about the biblical imagery that I did not see represented in the picture, that I think would be a very interesting conversation. Now, when I've heard Nate Parker actually talk about the movie, I want to give him some type of leeway in terms of his use of plot devices, because the movie itself was under-resourced. He had a very small budget. He had to kind of go around and really, literally placate people to finance the movie. I think he needed like $40 million. I think he got like 15 or something like that. And he had to kind of really literally go around and plead with people to do the movie. So the movie itself, he had to put his house up. He had to refinance his house. And then the creator of the movie, they thought it was supposed to be a 40-day shoot. He did it in 28 days. And even during that time, if they lost a day to weather, he said the shoot could have been just all over with because the insurance folks wouldn't have stayed that long. Wow. And during the movie, to try to actually do this, he had to actually, convince some of the white actors to act as cruel and terrible, because a lot of them were uncomfortable saying certain things to black folks because that's not who they are. So he had to actually manage like a certain type of black subjectivity of enslaved Africans and a white subjectivity and try to convince them to give their best performance to try to give that visual that he's going after. So there's a lot of, and then the marketing of it and that type of thing. I mean, there's a lot of, the creation of that type of product took an immense effort, and it was a coalition effort. So some of the critiques I have, and limitations I see with the movie, I want to, qualify that by saying that it took a lot of courage and took a maximal effort by many people to even get that shot, to get it where it is, and to actually go to Sundance and get it. I think he got a 6-minute standing ovation, and then people started to flood money into it after it was shot. Okay. So I want to say that this could be as with anything, it's not a conclusion, it's a starting point, maybe a stimulus for other types of conversation. And that's what I hope for the movie. When I look at it, I think one way of trying to understand the movie, instead of looking at it as the story of Nat Turner historically, to look at, theologically, like a story of how God is working through Nat Turner to try to do it, like as a gospel person is trying to do it, like as a gospeler. Like I'm seeing him as an evangelist. Okay. And reading it as... You're reading Nate Parker as an evangelist. Nate Parker as an evangelist, trying to talk about... problematic, Adam. I'm saying that this is the way I'm reading his art piece. Okay. His art piece is trying to use Nat Turner to talk about how God acts in the world in terms of that, through Nat Turner as the vehicle for that, and saying that resist, rebellion, and these are the themes he's trying to configure in terms of a Black liberationist perspective. So, and do you think that it's convincing? I mean, even if you look at it from that lens, that Nate Parker is acting as evangelist through this film to reveal to us, I'm just kind of saying back to you what you've said so I can make sure I have it right. To reveal to us how God acts in history, which is the primary claim of Black liberation, a primary claim of Black liberation theology, right? That God is acting in the world, in history. Is his effort convincing? That's a good point. And it's to different audience it is. I mean, most people I talk to in my personal life, they like the movie. I probably wasn't as moved by it as a lot of people were. But I inhabit a different type of subjectivity. So I'm not, I actually read this stuff and I kind of live in a certain type of different subjective world. So for me, because I didn't read, I don't know if I felt that way. I don't know if I, not so much the reading of it, but I don't know if I gleaned a God who is acting in the world through this story. Like, I'm not sure that is what was communicated for me. Here's why I think that. It's because of the ending. The ending to me looked more like a crucifixion. Right. It looked like his Christological. Right. Let's do it. Let's do this. To me, it looked like, and we may disagree about this, but that's okay.
Yeah.
It looked like his co-conspirators were looking at a Christic figure on the cross and weeping and crying. And then at the end, you see all of these type of efforts to try to not let his legacy go forth, right? Like they skin him, they dismember him.
Dismember his body.
They dismember his body. They kill other people who may be influenced by him. So just the effort in terms of trying to maintain the demonic system of slavery, to try to keep that type of motion back, is, to me, is like reminiscent of like the Roman Empire. Trying to like keep that type of the ascension of Christ, in terms of intact and contain that. But the victory in terms of we're talking about it like hundreds of years later, is that death doesn't have the last word in terms of that.
So, and this is where we have, I think, some disagreement here, because so my next question is, well, it doesn't, because they look dead to me. I mean, right. So, I mean, so this is where, I mean, I hear you, and I absolutely agree. As I was watching the film, the ending scene was definitely a Christological moment, right? He is hanging. I'm not sure if it was from a tree, but he was hanging from some wooden structure. Right. And people were looking up, and some were cheering. The white folks were cheering, and the black folks were crying, right? Right. But I have to, I mean, I can't, so I hear that, and I recognize how that narrative could make it seem, right, like death doesn't have the last word, but they died. Like, the film cuts to, all those people hanging from trees and down on the ground, and so I feel down on the ground, shot or, killed with an axe or what have you. I default to Williams, right? And this idea of Dolores Williams, when she says that we cannot glorify this kind of violence, right? We cannot, I mean, is this really God, or is this really God acting in history, or is this just sinful humanity, right? That is.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
You see what I'm saying?
I see. So, I don't mean to read it as like predestination or providential. Like I'm not taking that part. I'm using it more rhetorical. Meaning that Christic rhetorical, not like in terms of that it was providence, that he was chosen to actually die, in terms of that. I don't want to read it that. I don't want to have a hardline Christology to say exactly it's identical to. But I'm saying he's being figured in that way, in a Christic way, in terms of that. And it's not like people are like worshiping him or trying to find God, and he's a mediator for it. But I'm saying that he becomes the spirit of resistance in terms of that he lives through other people, that you could tell the story of resistance. He's a martyr, in terms of a martyr for Black liberation. And that martyred word for Black liberation starts to live on through other people, through us retelling the story. And that's what I see in terms of that, and seeding Black theological projects in terms of that he's part of, that we have a legacy to go to. There's only been, I mean, as you know, there's only been 3 like major rebellions at that time, through Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner. He was the largest one. Right. The only in terms of materially successful one we have is in Haiti, with Toussaint and Dessalines, that actually created a real birth of a nation. Like, they started the actual nation after that. But other than that, you would say they all failed. But how do you make meaning out of that failure, right? Like, and I'm saying the Christic idea of he died and is resurrected, in terms of that, at least in spirit, is the way you make meaning out of that his martyred death. And that's how I'm reading him, in terms of that he's trying to tell the story about the incarnation of a black liberationist or Black revolutionary who actually rises, who actually dies and rises. In terms of that, rises in the form of his legacy that we see in the young boy who becomes a man fighting on the side of the Union Army. Exactly. Yeah. At the end of the movie. Yeah. I think that is the director's lens. And I think that's how I would say that's probably why we still discuss him. I mean, there are many slave revolts. Didn't reach the level of Nat Turner, but there are many slave revolts, but he's the one who gets recalled in memory, right? He's the one who becomes part of our cloud of witnesses. Right. in terms of that. And I think it's because of that he becomes part of our cloud of witnesses.
Well, so I want to ask a question. I want to go back to, or I want to think about the women in the film.
Yes.
Because as we talk about this sort of martyrdom, as we talk about liberation in the cloud of witnesses, I just feel, and as we think about Black liberation theology, which and its relationship to Black women historically. I mean, I think that I want to know why. I don't want to know why Nate Parker kind of placed these scenes that are not historically attested to, these scenes of Black women's sexual violation, not historically attested to in any documents that we have about Nat Turner, in the movie. Like what, I'm just trying to figure out what that actually says about the film and placing them in such a way that the women don't even really get to speak about.
Right.
Or that show, I mean, the film gives no evidence. So we want to lift it up as this kind of paradigm for Black liberation, a story of the birthing of a Black liberation movement through this great witness, Nat Turner, which I get. And I'm here for that. But I'm wondering, especially given the shape of Black liberation theology's birth and even how we understand its genealogy in some ways, and Black womanism becoming its own kind of strand of Black theological inquiry, I'm wondering about how these women are silenced in the movie. I mean, I can't, I mean, and how we can actually read this film as a film of Black liberation with that being the case.
Right.
Another interesting point is about how is the Black child, the little boy, who is a part of the rebellion, and then I'm not sure if he runs away or he gets taken away, but he ends up back with his master, right? And it's almost like a demonizing of Black youth, right? It almost the film reads as if this boy kind of told, you know what I'm saying? This Black child. And so I don't know. I'm struggling with lifting this film up.
And then repents at the end. He repents at the end. He's kind of crying.
He's crying, but I feel
he's a Judas figure, kind of like that.
Yeah. I mean, how does the Black child become Judas? I'm torn with lifting this up as like the film of Black liberation theology. Number one, because I think the theology was, in some ways, it was kind of bad. It was badly done. But on the other hand, I mean, there are some real elements that are not liberative to major segments of the Black community. I
totally agree. Look, and I want to be clear what I'm trying to say. I'm saying he's using that as a rhetorical frame. I'm just trying to articulate the rhetorical frame. I'm not saying it works in all cases.
Okay.
So I'm saying that rhetorically, he's trying to use these type of tropes and images to frame the story or re-articulate the story of Nat Turner. And I say I could see that more. And I think that's for people who have praised the movie. I think that's what they're praising because they have a familiar frame of a Christological story that they're familiar with. And then they see Nat Turner kind of hitting those markers. And that's why they say, wow. Other people, like we know, Black historians, they haven't been as favorable toward the movie because they are in the actual story of Nat Turner. And they see such a disjunction that they have a hard time embracing the movie, independent of all the controversy. Now, for those who because their rape is and sexual violence is such a prominent place in that movie, and we don't see that in the historical record, it leaves us to believe that, as the feminist said, the personal is political. A lot of his personal stuff comes to be worked out artistically by inserting that into Nat Turner's story. So he's trying to really use these as plot devices to get to the larger point. I think that is not success. But actually, I mean, flippantly, I could say, look, the gospel writers didn't really have women characters speak that much in the gospels themselves too. So he could be reproducing the same patriarchy that's actually in the gospel.
Exactly. exactly. Which is problematic, right? I mean,
right.
And maybe it's just true, right? Maybe this patriarchy is part and parcel of Black liberation theology and
of the Christian tradition. He's reproducing the same type of blindnesses without any type of alteration in terms of that.
Which is a problem, right? Which is why I think so many women can't get behind the movie.
Yeah, that and other things. Yeah, I would agree.
That and other things.
Right? Yeah, no, there's a definite limitation because you don't have a female character who has worth independent of the male protagonist.
That's it.
Right? So there's not like a thing of female agency. The one thing I thought women at one point might have been, seen as healers because you saw them mending broken Black bodies throughout, whether it be a male body or a female body, they're all that type of thing. So I thought that, to me, that actually kind of moved me to see that, and I thought I connected to that.
How is that distinct from kind of a patriarchal vision of women?
It's not
nurturers and healers, and this is a surrogacy trope, right? That we take care of everybody else. Right. But, are unable to really exert a certain kind of agency for ourselves.
No, you're absolutely right. This wasn't a negation of the point. This was a separate
okay.
within the point.
But Adam, you just said you found comfort in that, right?
Yeah, no, I thought it was, because to me, I guess it really reaffirmed the African tradition in terms of that not just that in the beginning, you have the male priest, right? In terms of like trying to purpose. And then throughout you have the healing kind of dimension. So if you look at kind of gender constructs as that being just the only thing that women do in terms of that, yeah, that's deeply problematic in terms of looking at the full range of female agency that should have been actually depicted within the narrative.
I mean, it just makes me think about, and let me just add to your point that there is one point in the film where the grandmother, I think it's when he marries, I think her name is Cherry Ann. Her real name was Madison though. When they marry, his grandmother, it was almost like a ceremony of laying on of hands, and his grandmother, all their hands are on them, they're kneeling, and his grandmother's praying. I thought that was interesting. She's standing in front of them praying. And I thought it was an interesting kind of priestly moment, that we see the grandmother embodying, even though, right, she is not the preacher ever, right? She's never confused for that, which is it mirrors like so many of the kind of patriarchal, pulpit politics, that we see even today, where you have these women who are, they are healers, right? And they are prophets and they are priests in their own right, and yet can never be confused for the preacher or the actual pastor. But it gets me, this conversation has me thinking about what does Black liberation actually look like? I mean, we can say that, the film suggests to me what it does not look like. Right? It suggests to me with clarity what it does not look like, just in terms of how Black women and Black children, I feel, are, on the one hand, silenced. On the other hand, I think demonized would not be too strong of a word. But in terms of the child, I thought it was very strange the way his narrative kind of ended.
Yeah, I didn't pick up on that strongly as you did. See, I saw it, I thought this film could work in terms of looking at the kind of classical idea of faith as divine initiative and human response. Like, I think that he's like trying to respond to what he feels is a divine initiative. I think the cultural forms in which he uses are very traditional, in terms of his traditional idea of he wants an alpha male and he wants kind of subordinate women. Yeah, subordinate women. So there's this idea of having this kind of real, like almost like this comes in the context of after Django Unchained and that type of thing, of this kind of alpha male, that kind of thing, that and people were like, well, we want a historical account of that. And in the Black communities talked about Django, they've talked about roots and said, look, we need to have something that shows a victory for Black folks. And most people saw the Nat Turner story or read it as victorious. Now, you could read it as a failure. That's not, you can read it as a failure in terms of that, because he does get caught and he gets executed because of that. And not just him gets executed, it causes, after
community.
Historically, you get like hundreds of black folks I think they killed about, what were the numbers on that? I think 60 whites, around 60 whites. The 48 hours, they killed like 60 whites.
And hundreds of black people.
Hundreds of Africans get killed as a consequence of that. And not only that, they pass repressive laws after that. I don't think the movie actually talked about that, but throughout the region, I think blacks couldn't have services by themselves without a white surveillance. I think they absolutely outlawed all reading and writing of black folks, Native Africans. So it got much more repressive and much more oppressive as a consequence of that. So you could read it as, look, it wasn't worth it. That little resistance actually made lives harder for Africans in that time period throughout the region, because it made it much more rigid in terms of that. But on the other hand, it becomes a model and a memory of resistance. And I think that's the majoritarian view of that. Because even when he goes, like, he almost, to me, he conjured like the Johannine Jesus when he like says, they ask him, "Are you ready?" He says, "Yeah, I'll go." And to me, that reminded me of the idea of, you don't take my life, I give it to you.
I give it to you, yeah.
Like almost a kenosis.
I lay it down, yes.
I lay it down, right. Like it seemed like Nat Turner to me was like kenotic in that sense. He's laying it down. He's going to the cross and that type of thing. And he's laying down all the stuff. So it's almost like he's mythological in that sense of the ending scene. And I think that's the way he's being conjured in the kind of mindset of Nate Parker. That he wants to give that.
But if you hold that intention with the scene just prior to his execution, where the house slave, I don't even know if he had a name, comes out and he's yelling at them and saying, did you kill the master? And he's saying, y'all are dead. Right. You're already dead. Can you, so what comes up for me is, can you lay your life down if it's already down?
Right. But to me, the response was a thing. Like, they looked at him like, we're already dead. And now I can see clearly. Like, to me, that was an act of resistance by them just like kind of not acquiescing to that. That was the way to evoke fear. And to me, it was just very courageous. They didn't even say anything to him. They just kind of just went and looked. They just kind of, in a nonverbal cue, it was like they were reaffirming their own humanity. So
in that moment, in a sense, so maybe they had been down, but in that moment, they're picking up their humanity, right? In that moment of just standing there and not actually, standing in their freedom, essentially.
This is Tillich's courage to be, right? Like actually going against the forces of non-existence and reaffirming yourself against the forces of non-existence. So it's a reaffirmation, and they had the courage to be, and then they go and revolt. To me, that was probably the most defiant part of the movie for me, even more than the actual violence. It was like when they said, you're going to die, and they just looked at him like, we've been dead. You can't do nothing to me, and that to me was the kind of the paradigmatic moment, the high point of the movie for me.
So let's talk about the first act of violence, right? So when he killed Sam, the master, and Sam crawls out into the hallway by the stairs. Right. And let's see, Nat is standing up over him, and Sam is slouched down on the wall. Yeah. And in between is that stained glass window with the cross. Do you remember that?
I don't remember the cross, but I remember the other part.
Okay, so cinematographically, I don't know if that's a word. Cinematically. Right. So Nat is standing like on the left. The master's slouched against the wall, bleeding on the right. He's about to die. And right in between them is like a window with a cross. I saw that without hesitation. I saw it. So I'm wondering, based on this courage to be, to kind of, to see oneself as already dead and therefore be willing to risk it all, right? To actually go to the cross. Is that what Christ calls us to? Is that what the cross calls us to?
It's a good question.
I mean,
I think in certain situations, yes. I mean, you have the misery of bodily existence, right? Like your body, like it's so, like there are some things in life that are worse than death, right? Like
absolutely.
Right.
I think.
But I think they're really in tune with that.
Right.
That's why you have like incidents of infanticide like that happen in those contexts too. That there are some things in life that imagine your life being so miserable that death is actually a release and is actually an escape from the misery of bodily existence. Right. So to me, they're alive for the first time. Right.
When they are running toward their death.
When they defy, the defiance of the forces of non-existence and the reaffirmation of yourself over and against that. Yeah. That they come free for the first time.
So then resistance or rebellion is Christian. Yeah. I think that's what he wants to get the message about. Yeah. That this is Christian. And I know that's the divided legacy, because going back to what you talked about, Dolores Williams, I mean, Dolores Williams is one of the earliest people to raise the question about the status of violence within Christian traditions, right? Like, what is the moral status of violence? And she particularly looks at the crucifixion. But you could look at a lot of things, I mean, in terms of what is the status of violence within Christian faith. And, you know, whites never have a problem with this type of thing. I mean, Revolutionary War, right? Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. That type of thing, even though he owned slaves in the revolution, they had slaves, give me all this type of things. But when it comes to us, it becomes, it seems like, and I'm also drawing from, I remember I saw a 60 Minutes interview where they interviewed the descendants of both Nat Turner and the slave owners. Okay. And they disagreed. They were actually pretty friendly with each other, which is a little strange. It's very strange. Yeah, it was very strange. Yes, you're right. And the white families said, well, we don't regard him as a hero. Like, he basically like slaughtered all these people. And what really bothered them was the women and children. It was always the women and children, because historically he went back after, and he killed like a 9-year-old, and he then went back and killed the babies. Right. So technically, under kind of modern convention, that would be considered war crimes and that type of thing. So people look at that to try to say that. But to me, that I'm sorry to interrupt you, but to me, that's just that's so outlandish, right? That they would lift up Nat Turner or the killing of women and children as a reason to not look at him as a hero, but they were killing women and children every day. Right. I mean, I agree. But go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just had to get that in. These are the inconsistencies, right, of the so-called faithful. Right. Like they actually like, and so much so that Parker didn't even show that in the movie. Remember, it's male on male violence. You don't see women dying. You don't see children dying, white children dying. You don't see white children. And he was scared. I mean, he literally said, well, scared might be too strong a word. That's probably true. But what he said was that he didn't want to be too sensational. But Nat Turner did. One of the reasons why he did it in his own confession, he said, he wanted to initiate like what later was a civil war. He wanted to make violence a spectacle so that people could see the evil and brutality of slavery. Absolutely. And wanted them to work. And he's using the resources at hand to do that. Right. And what happens in retrospect, the children actually try to question the status of, did he have to do that? Did he have to like go into baby carriage and, hit him with a knife or hit him with a mullet or whatever, that kind of thing? Because they didn't use muskets and guns and that type of thing because they didn't want to alert another plantation. So they did it. So they did it through clubbing people to death, which is a pretty tough thing to do. And you have to have it's a tough thing to actually like physically manhandle someone to death like that. So
So part of like the conversation was about, is he really a prophet that they had? Of course, like the Black community views him as a prophet. The white community, the white slave owning community were kind of like, well, it's not my role to determine what he is, but we don't view him in the same way and that kind of thing. And it talks about the tangled legacy of slavery in this country, like how, when regard, and the kind of selective morality that people have, not seeing the institutional violence. Like I think Frantz Fanon is the best on this. He talks about, it's not violent, it's counter-violent. Right. Like it's like doing jujitsu. It's taking the violence of the system and using it against them. Right. Because even Nat Turner, in one of his visions, said, I'm going to take their weapons and use it against them. Right. And then he talks about cutting off the head. I mean, in one, there's a beheading in the actual movie. And he's reading scripture. He says, cut the head off the serpent. That's it. To him, he's cutting the head off the serpent. That's it. Reading that literally. And later accounts will call him a religious fanatic and try to discredit him and that kind of thing. But that's one of the reasons why. It's even interesting. I don't know if we have time to actually get into this, but you could do a whole conversation about the different interpretations in historical periods of Nat Turner, because they interview him in his cell. I think he's in his cell for 6 days, and there's a first account. They look at him the way someone will look at Manson. What's his name?
A serial killer?
Yeah, a serial killer, basically. And they're trying to say,
a psychopath, yeah.
Yeah, they're trying to like look at him and saying that Charles Manson, that's what I'm thinking of. They're looking at him as if, like, during that time, the image of blacks were their happy darkies. They like to serve people as slaves. And they're looking at that, wow, these people don't really like this. Like, it's amazing to them because he's looked at as even though he was very smart and gifted, they looked at him as a noble savage. So how does this noble savage go bad? So the first accounts of him, they had by some guy named, I think it's William Gray, I believe. He interviews in the cell. Now, it's hard to tell how reliable that account will be because, of course, he's a white supremacist. He thinks he's great. But then later tried to always figure him as a religious fanatic, even though to his co-conspirators, he was seen as a prophet and a general. Right. A general in the Lord's army and a prophetic figure. So just the competing interpretations to look at the status of violence within the context of Christian faith movements is really fascinating for people who want to access the kind of moral quality of movements, because we're so dominated by King and Gandhi and idea of nonviolence that it's hard for people to see God moving in that way.
And that's the love ethic, right? And to the dismissal of righteousness and wrath. Right. But I to add to that, I was going to say that we see that though now in how liberation theology is even dealt with in churches and in seminaries, right? How it is seen as kind of a radical, kind of fringe. I'm not sure if this is your experience, but it has been mine in the past, at least, that it's, it is not normative. It is this radical other thing, right? And so it's not just a thing of the past, right? That we can look on historically, but it's in the present as well, right? Where churches will read a certain kind of liberationist narrative, Christian narrative, as fanaticism, and therefore illegitimate. Right. Where you have other communities who understand it to be prophetic and a call to life for those who are oppressed.
Well, I'm in a kind of Jesuit Catholic context, and they do affirm liberation theology, but but mostly as a class-based analysis.
Absolutely. Latin American, right? And that's emerging from the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America.
But when you talk about race as a factor in social inequity, they don't see that as a liberationist project. They might see it as a project of discrimination, but not as racial oppression, right? So discrimination is a much weaker claim than oppression. Absolutely. So the idea of trying to...
That's so hilarious. You make that distinction, but you're absolutely right.
If you talk about racial oppression, and this is what Nat Turner kind of shows where this legacy is, why it's important to have a conversation about this, is to look at like the brutality of racial oppression and how that legacy still exists today in terms of even competing interpretations. And I think that's why he named it Birth of a Nation as a kind of trope to try to re-trope the original Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffin in the early 20th century. that really was the revitalization of the KKK.
Mm-hmm.
Talked about fear of black folks and black folks as the myth of the black rapist and all this stuff like that they're going. So after the Birth of a Nation, black people were hung. There were other types of Jim Crow laws that were reinscribed.
Right.
And I think the idea of Nat Turner as being part of the Birth of a Nation is really talk about the birth. This is the real birth of this nation through this kind of chattelized slavery of human property and really getting that into the national story.
Right, right. And the ways in which the birth of a nation, but also for me, the reality of the nation, right? Mm-hmm. So in one of the ending scenes when they make it to Jerusalem, and his best friend, they're shooting and they're hiding in that little barn. And one of his closest friends, if not his closest friend, runs out and is shot multiple times in his chest and falls backward. So for me, that was very reminiscent of, the shooting death of so many black men and women right now in this moment. And how the birth of a nation really continues to be its reality in so many ways.
Yes.
Which is why these conversations about liberation and faith or liberation theology continue to be so relevant, right? Because people are really, there are communities of people who continue to be bound by social indicators that say race, but not just race. And a lot of evangelical communities want to talk about race, but we have to recognize that oppressions are always intersectional. So race, gender, class,
right.
And other indicators, but certainly race, gender, and class, how these things subordinate certain groups. And how, and makes the birth of the nation the actual stuff of the nation right now.
Yeah. And I mean, that's where the whole, when we talk about the thematically Black Lives Matter, right? Mm-hmm. We're trying to talk about like Nat Turner said, Black Lives Matter.
True that.
They matter so much that they should not be enslaved, right? Like they are that he actually, and this is where I'm saying in terms of like why I think it works better theologically than it does historically.
Okay.
Theme. I think it works that way. Although with qualifications, the necessary qualifications about gender and other things that we've mentioned throughout this conversation. Mm-hmm. I think that theme itself is a really important type of conversation that really has a lot of resonance with our present situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, is there anything we should say in closing in terms of that? I know you've done a lot of work in terms of, I don't know if this has anything to do with like the Council of Nicaea and all these type of like documents you've done on the body and that type of thing. In terms of retrieving, the integrity and the kind of worth of Black bodies on that. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that you should mention that because, one of the reasons why I push back so hard against the cross is because even though, coming from the Black church, you gotta lift up the cross in some way, shape or form. But I push back so hard is because of my work on the incarnation and via the Council of Chalcedon in my book, Toward a Woman's Ethic of Incarnation, and, how I understand brokenness to be articulated really through the body of Christ and how Christ is considered, made sense of through that tradition, through that council. And essentially what I'm arguing is that wholeness can be, I'm arguing what the movie, I guess, points toward, even in its imperfect ways. And that is that wholeness can be approximated even in the most broken and impossible of situations, right? That there is a way in which the body that is broken in these absurd and tragic ways can actually be made whole. And it's through wrestling with the pain of kind of socio-historical realities and with the promise of a God who is working in our bodies, who is working in history otherwise. That you can't have one and not the other, right? You can't be stuck on, the historical realities, the social historical realities, and you can't be stuck on some God in the, pie in the sky, right? That God is actually working in the body, in the broken body, amidst the broken body. And navigating, mediating between those poles that are so oppositional, it seems, helps us to get closer to the promise of God in Christ, which is a future, which is wholeness, which is redemption. And so, that's...
So what would a soteriologic look like in terms of that context with Nat Turner? Do you think if you had to reimagine it in that type of Christic atonement vision, what would be an alternative vision that we should consider within the context?
So, I mean, a soteriologic emerging out of the film would probably look like would look like a certain sort of disrespectability. And I guess we can read disrespectability in the cross, right? Because of course, I mean, cursed is he who hangs upon a tree, right? There's a certain, kind of socially, historically, a certain disrespectability of the crucified. But I think that the redemption that's happening in the film is happening in the very counter narrative, right? The counter movement, the counter action that is happening in and through the bodies of the oppressed. So how they rise up, literally. I mean, it's choreographic in a sense, right? How they rise up and run toward death in order to find freedom, right? Is its own sort of, I mean, they are stepping outside of who they have been, of how they have been cast in society, right? They are transgressing certain kinds of boundaries. They are moving in ways that they are not supposed to as a subjugated chattel. And so I think that is the redemption. The redemption is in the way we move against injustice. It is in how we embody insurrection.
Yeah, you just gave me language of how I could say he won. He erected, the resurrection is a counter narrative, right? Like, I like that language. Like, I think the way we could talk about the victory is that even though he dies and he never gets to Jerusalem, he gets death, that the martyred is a resurrection of a counter narrative, a new possibility of being human in a new way in terms of that. One that's a defiant possibility. And I think he gives us access to that in a situation of despair and hope. And I think that's probably the best possibility of trying to read Nat Turner for contemporary communities, is looking for those counter narratives.
Yeah. Reading Nat Turner.
Yeah. I think that's it. And if the movie could actually stimulate those type of conversations, I think it would have done a service in terms of that. But Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. Finish your thought there.
Oh, but those counter narratives has to be appropriately gendered, in terms of that it's not just it's the embodiment, right? Like how that's embodied. And I think that's where the limitations of the vision kind of are, is that he doesn't envision counter narratives embodied in the female body as equally as he does in male bodies.
Right. And perhaps, though, I mean, I don't want to collapse in this moment, Nate and Nat. So perhaps that is Nate's liability. But it may not have been Nat's liability.
Sure.
And you know what I'm saying? And so I think that as we tell the story of the martyr, we should remember that Black women's lives matter too.
Right.
And that, there is, I mean, in many ways, even in the film, I mean, there is no Nat Turner without his mother and his grandmother.
Exactly.
Who took him out into the woods to be, conjured and, to be, prepared.
Right.
To be prepared for what would lie ahead. And so And not just that. I mean, we know from the historical record that women were very much present. Black women were very much resisting, but no one was necessarily writing down their stories. And so,
exactly, right.
So I think it's important, to your point about gender and resistance, that we recognize that although that may have been a liability for Nate and his objective of kind of evangelizing Nat Turner, it wasn't necessarily Nat's liability. So
right. I meant to make that distinction, but if I didn't, I'm glad you did.
No, and I may just be restating. It's kind of late. I might be going in circles by now.
No, but thank you very much. I appreciate the conversation. You helped me come to a certain type of clarity, and we're both thinking out loud. About a week from now, we probably have a different type of conversation after we kind of reflect on this more.
Exactly. Yeah.
So appreciate it.
A good start.
All right.
A longer conversation.
Exactly. All right. Well, take care.
All right. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Ebony.
Next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.